We're living in a time unlike anything we've seen in 5,000 years of recorded human history. One of the principles that makes now so very different is globalization. So there are approximately 8 billion people, almost 8 billion people on the planet. So we are globalizing, we're pushing together over almost 8 billion people on the one hand, and we're asking ourselves to make sense of this globalization through the thinking that's based in separation. So we have new cultures and different languages and different religions and the way that men think about women and the way women think about men that we've always become accustomed to in our own little pods. And now as we globalize, we're coming together. We've been taught, it's all a product of our thinking. We've been taught that we're separate from one another. We've been taught to judge. So there is a lot of fear when something new, when a new culture, a new religion comes into our community, and that fear is often expressed as hate. And we are seeing an emergence of hate in the world based upon the color of our skin, upon our sexual orientation, upon our religion, in ways that we've never seen before, and people don't know what to do about that. So governments are passing laws making it illegal to speak hate or to do hateful acts. And I think that might be a step in the right direction, but ultimately those laws don't change the way we think. If you make it illegal to hate, you just will not express it, but you may still be feeling it. If we're really going to do more than put a bandage on the hate that's emerging in the world, we've got to go to the core of where the problem comes from. And it's only possible because of the way we've been taught to think. We've been told a story of human origin that says that we're the product of a random process, some very lucky biology that just happened to occur a long time ago, and that competition has been the rule of nature that has allowed us to be successful. Now, these ideas were encapsulated by Charles Darwin in 1859 in the book called Origin of Species. And I know that sounds like a long time ago, but it's important because the foundation of the society that we live in right now was being put in place during the late 1800s, early 1900s. So the foundation of our economic system is based on competition, Darwin's ideas. It's the foundation of our corporate systems, the way that we have been taught to deal with one another in terms of nations, in terms of communities, but it even comes down to our most intimate relationships. When we are in the privacy of our own home and our vulnerabilities are most present, the people that know us the most, when we have a disagreement, they'll often go for the most hurtful things to say to us. That is a product of thinking, of this competition, dog-eat-dog world. And the problem with this is that it's based upon a false assumption. The best science of the 20th and now the 21st centuries are telling us that nature is actually based upon a model of cooperation, not competition. And that while we see competition, I mean, we have to be real. Competition certainly exists. The greater the degree of competition, that tells us how far we've strayed from the natural harmony and the natural order of the natural world. So when we're looking for sustainable solutions to the problems between nations, or we're looking for sustainable healing in our most intimate relationships, the model that is probably the closest to what is going to bring joy and harmony in our lives is a model based upon nature, and that is cooperation. It's about honest, truthful, factual communication. And this is where heart-brain harmony can become so powerful. Because we're having a very difficult conversation with a partner, a life partner, a spouse, or a sibling, or a child, or in the workplace, or the university with a professor. If we go in from our mind, then our mind is already poised for competition. And we're looking at the rightness, the wrongness, the goodness, the badness, the implications. When we harmonize the heart and the brain, we are no longer in the polarity of the mind, and we free ourselves from that polarity. We become much more objective to what is said to us, much less reactive when something hurtful comes our way. And in that way, we empower ourselves with extraordinary levels of communication. And this is one of the functions of being able to access this heart-brain harmony. It's beyond simply a spiritual tool. What we call extraordinary potential, I personally believe is ordinary potential that we've simply forgotten or only beginning to understand and learn about ourselves. And I personally believe that these abilities of self-regulation and of living our lives in states of deep intuition, this is an everyday way of being, not something we do in a special moment of time when we go into a room in our house and put out the yoga mat and light the candle, burn the incense and turn on the soft music and close our eyes and have our spiritual practice. That's good. But when we most need to be at our best, when we most need the greatest capacities of understanding and conscious listening and the ability to go beyond our judgments, is when circumstances are usually least opportune. It's when we're in the heat of the moment. We don't have our yoga mat and our candles and our incense and our soft music. We're in the real world. This is the workshop of life. It can take lifetimes to reach this point where we do not assign so much significance to the events of our lives, to what happens in our lives. And that significance is the result of the filters that we develop from the time that we were childhood. Our programming begins when we're in our mother's womb, and we begin through the chemical signals of her body. If she's in a stressful environment, those chemicals are coursing through our bodies, and we become accustomed to stress chemistry, to high levels of adrenaline and cortisol if our mother is in that state. And that influences our development and the way that we think up until the age of about 7 years old. The Jesuits knew this a long time ago, and what they would say classically, they would say, give us your children until the age of 7, and they'll be ours forever. And what they were saying is, let us indoctrinate them until the age of 7, because from the age of birth to about 7, brain state is a very receptive state, very open, no filters. And whatever it is that we learn in those years becomes the foundation, the principles that we believe are true, and it's the way we live our lives. So after 7 years old, they'd say, you can go home to your families if you want. And they would go home to lives that made no sense to them because they were indoctrinated into a way of thinking that worked with the Jesuits. And while we're not Jesuits, it's true for all of us. We all are indoctrinated through the thinking of our family. We learn to solve our problems through the eyes of our parents and the way they solve their problems when we are young, or whoever our caregivers are, whether they are birth parents or whether they are assigned caregivers or an orphanage or an uncle or an aunt. This is where we learn. We're not defined by those experiences. If they don't serve us, we can recognize that maybe our caregivers learned how to deal with life in ways that were not as healthy as we would choose. And that's where our personal workshop begins. But first, we have to know that we're not defined by our circumstances. We have to know that we have a choice. We have to know that we are soft, emotionally malleable beings, and that our emotions, we can change the filters. We can change the way we choose to be in the world. And it takes 3 things. It takes the wisdom to recognize that possibility, the courage to move forward and say, yes, this is now my path, and the strength to follow through. So many people make the choice, they never follow through, or many people make the choice and they say, yes, I'm going to do this. It takes a lot of strength, emotional strength, and a deep belief in yourself and who you are, so that you are no longer defined by the way other people think. Because when we begin to change the way we think and live, and our friends are used to seeing us one way, some of them sometimes have a problem with that change. If we don't know who we are, then it's very easy to fall back into the old patterns. Perfect place where you're seeing this is with young people today. Young people in the cyber world can be deeply influenced by their peers and what their friends at school or their peers write about them on Facebook, Twitter, social media, YouTube videos. If those young people do not have a rock solid understanding, an emotional anchor that they have acquired from their home life, if their parents and their siblings have not instilled within them a deep truth of who they are, when they go out into the world and they hear that criticism, sometimes they'll believe it. And sometimes they believe it so deeply they feel they have no worth, and they'll take their own lives because they believe there is no worth in their lives. If they have those anchors, then that anchor is what sustains them, and they still receive the criticism, but it doesn't mean the same thing. Our life is something more than a random process. And I personally believe that the hate that we are seeing in the world is because we've been conditioned to discount the value of life, the sanctity of life. We've been taught that life is cheap. It's very easy to take a life if you see it as a video game, or if you are inundated with films and movies where life is taken left and right. It's hard to distinguish that and make that distinction from what happens in everyday life. When we begin to instill the sacredness of life in our young people again, that's where we begin to heal the hate. And that is where a new world begins. Humans are funny in that we tend to learn by experiencing first what we don't want before we don't want it, rather than saying, this is what I choose, and putting our energy in that direction. It doesn't have to be that way, but we had to have 2 global wars before we said no more war. We've had to have Holocaust before we say no more Holocausts. We've had to have these atrocities before we say no more, rather than choosing to live in honoring all life and all beliefs in a universal sense. So I think anything is possible. What I'm seeing happening right now, barring any external large-scale event, there is an awakening of human consciousness that we've never seen before. And where that leads, I think, as we embrace the fact that we are a global family. We may not always like one another, but I believe we truly love one another. And I've seen evidence of that. We may not like the habits of one another every day, but when it comes down to life or death, we will lay our lives on the line for one another. And that's very unique. New discoveries now are showing that the words that we use to communicate every day in our lives direct the way the neurons fire and wire together in our hearts and in our brains. But to go beyond that, the way the words we use do more than influence what we think. The words that we use actually determine what we are capable of conceiving. Now, if you think about what this means, some languages are based in separation. So when we use words of separation, we're actually directing the neurons to fire in a way that invites us to solve our problems based in them and us, in winners and losers, in separation. This is where the spiritual principles of the past come in, because our words originally, if we follow the traditions of those who have come before us, were intended to be clear conduits for what we were feeling from within. So our words were designed, originally intended, to reflect our innermost emotions and feelings. And our innermost emotions and feelings of unity and of cooperation, of peace and love. Those kinds of experiences, when we use the language that reflects those experiences, we actually change the biology of our body so that our body wires and fires to reflect that unity and that healing. So it's a very, very different way of thinking about our relationship to the divine. When we communicate through our thoughts, feelings, emotions, and beliefs, we close our eyes and we feel that wholeness and we feel that oneness and that agape love, for all life. Every blade of grass, every rock suddenly looks beautiful, and we're feeling that. We've all felt that at some point. And when we actually communicate the words that reflect that, we're actually changing the biology of our body to reflect that wholeness. That's where the healing begins, because then the biology begins to come into alignment as well. So people have asked me, from our global family, how many people does it take to create a lasting change in the world? And there have been many ideas that have been evolving and have been refined over time. There was a time where the studies suggested the square root of 1% of a given population would be enough to tip the scales. This was from the TM studies, that were transcendental meditation studies, that were done back in the 1970s, I believe, and into the 80s. And what they found was that in statistically significant, or cities over 100,000 people, statistically significant change occurred when the square root of 1% of that population would go into the TM process. Crimes against people would decline, emergency hospital room visits would decline, violent crimes would decline. But the problem was, when the people stopped what they were doing, all those statistics reversed, because the meditation was something that was done in the moment. And the key, as our ancestors told us, is not what we do, it's what we become. How do we become this way of being? Now, there are other studies that are showing that through the heart-brain coherence, in the presence of heart-brain coherence, the 0.1 hertz influencing populations, that we become more cooperative and less aggressive in the presence of those experiences. Now, I have found that to be true as well. There's a direct link between the magnetic fields of the Earth and the way that we deal with one another. And the bottom line is this, that when the magnetic fields are low, we become more aggressive, less cooperative. When the magnetic fields are high, we just reverse that. We become more cooperative with one another. In the past, we have waited for the planet to give us that higher magnetic field. We now know that collective human hearts, when many people come together in heart-brain coherence, we couple with the magnetic field of the Earth, and we can actually shift that field in a positive way. The question is, how many people does it take to do that? What the studies are now suggesting is that maybe less about the sheer number of people and more about the quality of the coherence that people are holding to achieve that threshold. So I don't know what the exact numbers are. I believe it probably takes more than one or two, but out of a planet of 8 billion people, it may not take that many in very clear coherence to tip the scales and stack the deck in our favor.